At 6:15 on the morning of March 3, 1943, Captain Paul Irving Gunn stood on the tarmac at Port Moresby, observing 12 B-25 Mitchell bombers taxi toward the runway. His hands were streaked with grease. His flight suit reeked of hydraulic oil and cigarette smoke. He had not slept in 36 hours. Those 12 bombers bore little resemblance to the aircraft that had emerged from the assembly line in California. Their glass noses had been replaced with solid metal plates bristling with 4.50 caliber machine guns. 4 additional guns protruded from blisters mounted on each side of the fuselage, 2 per side. 8 forward-firing guns on each plane. Pilots dubbed them commerce destroyers. The brass called them strafer planes. Everyone else referred to them as Pappy Gunn's folly. In the next 4 hours, those 12 aircraft would prove every doubter wrong. They would sink more Japanese vessels in a single engagement than the entire Pacific Fleet had achieved in months. They would alter the course of the war in the Southwest Pacific. And they would transform an underperforming medium bomber into the most heavily armed plane in the American inventory. But Gunn was not focused on any of that. His thoughts were with his wife Polly and their 4 children imprisoned in a Japanese internment camp in Manila, 1,500 miles to the north. He thought about how each Japanese ship he destroyed brought him one day closer to reuniting with them. What transpired over the Bismarck Sea that morning would justify everything Gunn had fought for. Yet the story of how a 43-year-old former Navy chief reshaped American air power begins 8 months earlier amid the debris of a disaster. When Major General George Kenney arrived in Australia in late July 1942, he found an air force in disarray. General Douglas MacArthur had recently dismissed his previous air commander for incompetence. The 5th Air Force had fewer than 200 operational aircraft scattered across bases from Brisbane to Port Moresby. Japanese forces dominated the skies over New Guinea. American bombers were being downed faster than they could be replaced. MacArthur summoned Kenney to his headquarters in Brisbane and delivered what Kenney later described as a 2-hour critique of everything wrong with his air force. The bombers could not hit their targets. The fighters could not provide cover. The maintenance crews could not keep planes in the air. MacArthur demanded results, and he demanded them immediately. Kenney listened quietly. When MacArthur concluded, Kenney made a promise. "Give me authority to run air operations my way, and I will deliver. If I fail, I will inform you and request my own relief." MacArthur agreed. It marked the beginning of a partnership that would reshape the Pacific Campaign. Kenney's first task was diagnosing why his bombers were failing. The answer became apparent within days. American doctrine instructed medium bombers like the B-25 to attack from 10,000 to 12,000 feet, dropping bombs on enemy ships and installations from relative safety. The problem, bombs released from that altitude rarely hit anything. Japanese vessels simply maneuvered out of the way. Meanwhile, Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire devastated the bomber formations. The B-25 had been conceived as a level bomber, not a combat aircraft. Its defensive weaponry was minimal. A single .30 caliber machine gun in the nose, 2.50 caliber guns in a dorsal turret, and a retractable belly turret that took nearly a minute to deploy and left the gunner violently airsick. The waist gunner had to physically move one gun from one side of the plane to the other. Kenney watched mission after mission return with empty bomb bays and bullet-riddled fuselages. His crews were courageous, but courage alone was insufficient. They needed a completely new approach. The solution came from an unexpected source. A few days after assuming command, Kenney visited the 3rd Bomb Group at Charters Towers in Queensland. There he discovered a middle-aged captain with a cigar clenched between his teeth, crawling inside the nose of a Douglas A-20 Havoc light bomber with a welding torch. The captain's name was Paul Irving Gunn. Everyone called him Pappy. Gunn was not supposed to be there. He wasn't even supposed to be in the Army. Before the war, he had served 21 years as an enlisted Navy aviator, retiring as a chief petty officer in 1939. He had moved his family to the Philippines and founded Philippine Airlines, one of the first commercial airlines in Asia. When the Japanese attacked in December 1941, the Army drafted him as a transport pilot. Gunn had flown reconnaissance missions over Baton and Corregidor, had been shot down twice, and survived both crashes. He had evacuated key personnel to Australia in the final desperate days before Manila fell. But his wife Polly and their 4 children, 2 sons, Paul and Nathan, and 2 daughters, Connie and Julie, were captured and interned at Santo Tomas University in Manila. From that point onward, Gunn fought the war with a singular purpose. Every mission, modification, and hour of labor brought him closer to freeing his family. Regulations, protocols, and chain-of-command considerations were irrelevant. His goal was killing Japanese soldiers and reaching Manila. Others in the theater noticed something exceptional about Gunn. Most soldiers wanted to survive, fulfill their duty, and return home. Gunn wanted to destroy. He took risks seasoned pilots deemed suicidal, volunteered for missions no one else would fly, and worked relentlessly, sometimes for days without sleep, driven by a rage fiercer than any engine he maintained. His age should have kept him grounded. At 43, he was old enough to be the father of most pilots in the theater. The nickname Pappy reflected reality, yet he flew combat missions alongside men half his age with a ferocity younger pilots struggled to match. He was wounded 9 times, earning 9 Purple Hearts. Each time he recovered and returned to flying. His body bore the scars of shrapnel, burns, and crash landings, yet nothing slowed him. The only thing that mattered was his family in Manila. Every enemy soldier, sailor, or pilot he killed brought him closer to seeing them again. When Kenny discovered him at Charters Towers, Gunn was installing .50 caliber machine guns salvaged from wrecked P-40 fighters into the A-20's nose. His logic was simple: if bombers could not hit targets from high altitude, they must attack low. Low-level attacks required forward-firing guns to suppress enemy anti-aircraft fire. The A-20's nose, designed for a bombardier, would be useless in such an assault, so Gunn filled it with guns instead. Kenny observed silently before asking one question: could he do the same to the B-25? Gunn looked up from his welding with a smile. He had been waiting for someone to ask. The B-25 Mitchell was larger than the A-20, with longer range and heavier payload capacity. It could carry 3,000 pounds of bombs over 1,000 miles and return. But it had the same basic flaw: its nose was designed for a bombardier behind a glass greenhouse, not for offensive firepower. Gunn proposed a radical fix: remove the bombardier, replace the glass nose with a solid metal fairing loaded with .50 caliber machine guns, and add additional guns and external blisters along the fuselage. This would convert the medium bomber into a flying arsenal capable of strafing enemy defenses at masthead height. The concept was inspired by earlier experiments. The British had tried forward-firing guns on their fighters, and the Germans had armed Ju-88s with heavy cannons, but no one had attempted anything on the scale Gunn envisioned: 8.50 caliber machine guns firing forward simultaneously. Combined with skip bombing, it would create an entirely new form of aerial combat. Skip bombing itself remained experimental. Major William Benn of the 63rd Bomb Squadron had pioneered the method using B-17 Flying Fortresses in late 1942. The principle was simple: approach the target at low altitude and high speed, release bombs at a shallow angle a few hundred feet from the target, and strike with maximum precision. The bombs would skip across the water like flat stones, slam into the side of the vessel at the waterline, and detonate inside the hull. A direct hit below the waterline was far more damaging than a bomb striking the deck from above. But skip bombing with B-17s was awkward and dangerous. The big 4-engine bombers were too slow, too ungainly, too vulnerable at low altitude. The technique demanded a faster, more maneuverable aircraft. The B-25 was perfect for the role, but only if it could suppress the anti-aircraft fire that would otherwise tear it apart during the approach. That was where the forward-firing guns came in. Strafe the ship's deck during the approach. Kill the gunners before they could aim their weapons, then drop the skip bombs into the defenseless hull. It was elegant in its brutality. North American Aviation, the company that built the B-25, said it was impossible. The aircraft was not designed for that kind of stress. The weight and balance would be completely wrong. The recoil from that many guns firing simultaneously would shake the airframe apart. Gunn did not care what North Americans said. He had spent 20 years maintaining Navy aircraft in conditions the factory engineers could not imagine. He knew what worked and what did not, and he had a partner who shared his vision. Jack Fox was North American Aviation's field service representative in Australia. His job was to help maintain the B-25s and report problems back to the factory. Instead, he became Gunn's co-conspirator. Fox understood the aircraft's engineering. Gunn understood what it needed to do in combat. Together, they would rebuild the B-25 from the nose back. Their first prototype was a B-25C with serial number 41 to 12437. They called it Pappy's Folly. Gunn and Fox worked in a maintenance hangar at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane. They stripped out the bombardier's position and installed 450 caliber Browning machine guns behind a metal plate that replaced the glass nose. Each gun carried 500 rounds of ammunition. They added 4 more guns and external blisters, 2 on each side of the fuselage below the cockpit. The blisters were fabricated from sheet metal salvaged from wrecked aircraft. The work took weeks. Gunn pulled parts from every source he could find: guns from crashed fighters, ammunition from supply depots, sheet metal and welding rod from wherever he could beg, borrow, or steal. There are stories, never officially confirmed, that gun once threatened a Dutch supply officer with a Thompson submachine gun to obtain gun sights that had been allocated to another unit. When the prototype was finished, it bristled with 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. The pilot could unleash all 8 simultaneously, pouring over 6,000 rounds per minute into a target directly ahead. No bomber in any air force had ever carried that kind of forward firepower. The first test flight nearly ended in disaster. The weight of the guns and ammunition had shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward. The B-25 wanted to nose over on takeoff. Gunn and Fox spent another week adjusting the installation, moving the guns further aft, redistributing ammunition storage. The second test flight went smoothly. Then came the firing tests. Gunn took the aircraft up himself and dove on a target range at 200 miles per hour. He pressed the trigger on the control yoke. All 8 guns roared simultaneously. The aircraft shuddered. Smoke filled the cockpit. Spent brass casings ricocheted everywhere. The recoil was tremendous. 850 caliber Browning machine guns each produced over 100 pounds of rearward force when firing. Combined, they were pushing back with more than 800 pounds of thrust. The aircraft actually slowed in the air when all guns fired simultaneously. Pilots learned to compensate by adding power during strafing runs. The sound inside the cockpit was deafening. The vibration shook instruments loose from their mounts. The smell of cordite and hot gun oil permeated everything. Pilots came back from test flights with ringing ears and trembling hands, but the airframe held, the guns tracked true, and the target was shredded beyond recognition. The .50 caliber Browning M2 was the perfect weapon for this application. It fired armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds at over 2,800 foot-purse. The bullets could penetrate 20 millimeters of armor plate at 500 yards against unarmored ship hulls and deck structures. They were devastating against human beings caught in the open. They were unsurvivable. Each gun fired at a rate of approximately 800 rounds per minute. 8 guns meant 6,400 rounds per minute, directed at a single point. A 3-second burst put over 300 heavy caliber rounds into the target. Nothing built by human hands could absorb that kind of punishment and remain functional. General Kenny flew out to witness the next test. He watched Gunn make 3 firing passes on a derelict ship in the harbor. Every pass walked a stream of traces across the deck. By the 3rd pass, the ship's superstructure was in flames. Kenny had seen enough. He ordered Gunn to modify every B-25 he could get his hands on. The conversion program expanded rapidly. What began as a single prototype became an industrial operation. Gunn established modification centers at Eagle Farm near Brisbane and later at Townsville in Queensland. Teams of mechanics worked around the clock converting standard B-25s into strafers. The work was painstaking. Each aircraft required dozens of hours of labor. The bombardier station had to be stripped out entirely. New mounting brackets had to be fabricated and welded in place. Electrical systems had to be rewired to connect the guns to the pilot's controls. Ammunition feeds had to be installed. The whole nose section had to be reinforced to handle the recoil loads. Finding parts was a constant challenge. The .50 caliber Browning machine guns came from crashed fighters. Gunn sent teams to scour every wreck they could find, salvaging guns, ammunition, belts, feed mechanisms, anything that could be used. When official channels failed, Gunn improvised. He became infamous for requisitioning parts without authorization, for pressuring supply officers who refused to cooperate, for acquiring materials through channels that were not entirely within regulations. By late February 1943, 12 B-25s had been converted to strafers at the modification center in Townsville. They were assigned to the 90th Bomb Squadron of the 3rd Bomb Group commanded by Major Edward Lana. Lana was a bold pilot who had transferred from the States specifically to fly the new gunships. He drilled his crews relentlessly, practicing low-level attacks on wrecked ships in the harbor at Port Moresby. The pilots called the training terrifying, flying at 200 feet above the water, releasing bombs that skipped across the surface like flat stones, pulling up at the last possible moment to avoid the masts of the target vessel. A single mistake meant death. There was no margin for error at that altitude. But Lana believed in the concept. If the strayers could get in close, if they could suppress the anti-aircraft guns with their forward-firing weapons, they could put bombs directly into the sides of enemy ships. No more dropping from altitude and hoping. No more watching. Bombs splash harmlessly into the sea. Direct hits every time. The opportunity to prove the concept came sooner than anyone expected. On February 28, 1943, a Japanese convoy departed Rabaul on New Britain Island, bound for Lae on the coast of New Guinea. The convoy carried nearly 7,000 troops of the 51st Infantry Division along with ammunition, supplies, and fuel, 8 transport ships escorted by 8 destroyers. If those reinforcements reached Lae, they would pose a serious threat to Allied positions throughout New Guinea. The stakes could not have been higher. Japan had been on the offensive since Pearl Harbor. They had conquered the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, Burma, and most of the Pacific Islands. In New Guinea, they had pushed within 30 miles of Port Moresby before being stopped at the Kukukota track in Duna. If the 51st Division reached Lae, they would threaten to resume that advance. Allied intelligence had broken the Japanese codes. Kenny knew the convoy was coming. He knew its route. He knew its destination. He planned to destroy it. The attack would be the largest coordinated air operation the 5th Air Force had ever attempted. Heavy bombers would soften the convoy from altitude. Medium bombers and bow fighters would attack at masthead level. Fighters would provide top cover and strafe survivors. Every available aircraft would participate. The first attacks came on March 2 as the convoy passed through the Bismarck Sea. High-altitude bombers hit the convoy throughout the day, sinking one transport and damaging several others. But the results were disappointing. Hundreds of bombs had been dropped. Only a handful had found their marks. The remaining ships pressed on toward Lae. They would arrive the following morning unless something stopped them. That something was the strafers. At dawn on March 3, Major Lana led his 12 modified B-25s out of Port Moresby. They were joined by A-20 Havocs from the 89th Bomb Squadron and Bristol bow fighters from the Royal Australian Air Force. P-38 Lightning fighters flew top cover. The entire strike force numbered over 100 aircraft. The convoy was located at 9:15, 60 miles southeast of Finschhafen. 7 transports and 4 destroyers remained afloat, clustered together for mutual protection. Japanese Zero fighters circled overhead. The high-altitude bombers attacked first, forcing the ships to scatter and dividing the attention of the anti-aircraft gunners. Then came the bow fighters, raking the convoy at masthead height with their 20 mm cannons. The Japanese sailors were still recovering when Lana's strafers arrived. What happened next changed naval warfare forever. The 12 B-25s came in at 200 feet, engines screaming, 8 guns blazing from each aircraft. The combined firepower was staggering. 9,650 caliber machine guns tearing into the convoy simultaneously. Over 45,000 rounds per minute sweeping across the decks of the Japanese ships. Major Lana led the first element of 4 aircraft toward a large transport. As he approached, he keyed his radio. Wingmen were following too close. "Get the hell off my wing and get your own boat," he shouted. Each pilot needed to pick a separate target. Concentrating on single ships would waste their combined firepower. The pilots spread out, each selecting a different vessel. Lana aimed for a destroyer, its anti-aircraft guns already firing at the incoming aircraft. He pressed the trigger. Tracers reached out from his nose, walking across the water, climbing the hull, raking the deck. The anti-aircraft guns fell silent as their crews were cut down. Behind him, Captain John Hennebrey watched Lana make his run. Everybody was rather apprehensive, Henry recalled later. When everybody saw him make that pass and hit it with at least 1, and maybe 2, the explosion, and so that just ignited the whole thing. The guys got the idea if he could do it, they could do it. The anti-aircraft gunners never had a chance. Before they could track the incoming aircraft, they were dead or diving for cover. The strafers came so fast and so low that the Japanese could not depress their guns far enough to engage them. Naval anti-aircraft weapons were designed to track aircraft flying overhead, not aircraft flying at masthead level directly toward the ship. Then came the bombs. Each B-25 carried for 500-pound bombs equipped with delayed fuses. The pilots released them at 200 ft, skipping them across the water like stones on a pond. The bombs bounced once, twice, 3 times, then slammed into the sides of the transport ships at the waterline. The delayed fuses gave the aircraft time to clear the target before detonation. In the first 15 minutes, the Strayers scored 17 direct hits on 7 ships. 4 transports were sinking. 2 destroyers were burning. The convoy had ceased to exist as an organized force. Lana led his pilots back for a second pass, then a third. By 10:30, every transport in the convoy had been hit. Fires burned across the sea. Ships rolled over and sank. Thousands of Japanese soldiers who had been sleeping in their bunks were now drowning or burning or being strafed in the water. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was the debut of the B-25 Strafer, and it was a massacre. Over the next 2 days, Allied aircraft returned again and again to finish off the crippled convoy and attack the survivors. By the time the battle ended on March 5, all 8 transports and 4 of the 8 destroyers had been sunk. Of the nearly 7,000 Japanese troops who had embarked at Rabel, fewer than 1,200 reached Leh. Another 2,700 were rescued and returned to Rabel. The rest, approximately 3,000 men, were killed. American losses were 13 air crew killed or missing. 4 aircraft shot down in combat, 2 crashed in accidents. The ratio was unprecedented. Nothing like it had been seen in naval warfare since the Age of Sail. News of the victory electrified. General MacArthur called it one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. General Kenny sent a message to his pilots. Air Power has written some important history in the past 3 days. Tell the whole gang that I am so proud of them. I am about to blow a fuse. But the Japanese noticed something else, something that terrified them. Japanese pilots who survived the battle reported that the American bombers had attacked with unprecedented aggression. They flew lower than any bombers the Japanese had ever seen. So low that their propellers kicked up spray from the waves. They absorbed anti-aircraft fire that should have knocked them out of the sky and kept coming. And their forward firepower was devastating. The guns never stopped firing from the moment they began their attack runs until they were climbing away over the burning ships. The traditional Japanese defense against air attack had been optimized over years of combat. Ships would turn bow on to torpedo bombers, presenting the smallest possible target. Anti-aircraft gunners would track incoming aircraft and lead them appropriately. Fighter cover would intercept before the bombers could release their weapons. These tactics had worked against everything the Allies had thrown at them for the first year of the war. Against the strafers, none of it worked. Turning bow on did nothing against aircraft that were strafing rather than dropping torpedoes. The anti-aircraft guns could not track targets moving that fast at that angle. The fighters could not engage bombers flying at treetop level without risking collision with the water or the ships themselves. Japanese naval commanders conducted a formal assessment. Their conclusion was grim. The Americans had developed a new type of aircraft, a bomber that could fight like a fighter. The traditional tactics for defending convoys against air attack no longer worked. Any attempt to reinforce New Guinea by sea would end the same way. Admiral Masatomi Kimura, who had commanded the convoy escort, reported to his superiors that the American air attack was unlike anything in Japanese experience. The combination of strafing and skip bombing had proven devastatingly effective. He recommended that no more troop convoys be sent to eastern New Guinea without overwhelming air superiority. Staff Officer Masatake Okumiya was more blunt. Our losses for this single battle were fantastic. He wrote, not during the entire savage fighting at Guadalcanal did we suffer a single comparable blow. We knew we could no longer run cargo ships or even fast destroyer transports to any front on the north coast of New Guinea east of Waiwik. On March 25, 1943, Imperial General Headquarters issued a directive. There would be no more attempts to land troops at Leh. All reinforcements would be sent to Waiwak or Hansa Bay, far to the west, beyond the range of the new American strafers. The Japanese expansion in New Guinea had been stopped and it was only the beginning. After the Bismarck Sea, demand
for strafer conversions exploded. Every B-25 squadron in the Pacific wanted the modification. Kenny established conversion centers at Townsville and Brisbane, then expanded operations to handle the volume.
By the summer of 1943, more than 60 B-25s had been converted to Struffers. By the end of the year, the number exceeded 200. P. Gunn did not rest. Even as his original design was being replicated across the theater, he was working on improvements. More guns, better ammunition feeds, auxiliary fuel tanks to extend range,
camera mounts in the tail to document attacks. Each modification made the strafers more lethal. In August 1943, the strafers proved their worth again at WWII.
The Japanese 4th Air Army had concentrated nearly 200 aircraft at 4
airfields around WWII.
Preparing for a major offensive, Kenny decided to destroy them on the ground.
The problem
was range. WWII was over 500 m from Port Moresby, beyond the escort range of
American fighters.
Heavy bombers could reach WWII, but without fighter protection, they would be vulnerable to
Japanese interceptors.
Kenny needed to find a way to get his fighters closer to the target.
He found the solution in an abandoned pre-war airstrip near the village of Marilyn High in the Owen Stanley Mountains about 300 m south of WWII. Australian infantry secured the area while American engineers rushed to make the strip operational. The work was done in secret. Japanese reconnaissance never detected the activity. Meanwhile, Kenny ordered a brilliant deception. Construction crews built dummy airfields at Benabina and other locations, raising large clouds of dust to make it appear major bases were being constructed. Japanese bombers attacked these fake airfields repeatedly.
Convinced they were preventing Allied occupation, the real base at Marilyn remained undetected. On the night of August 16, 50 B-7s and B-24s bombed the WWII
airfields from high altitude.
The Japanese were caught off guard, but scrambled fighters to intercept.
Several
bombers were damaged, but the raid accomplished its primary purpose.
It alerted the Japanese that an attack was underway and prompted them to prepare their aircraft for immediate takeoff the following morning. The attack on August 17 caught the Japanese completely by surprise. B-25 strafers came in at treetop level from a direction the Japanese had not anticipated. Their guns blazing, strafing aircraft lined up on
the runways with their engines running and pilots aboard.
The Japanese were waiting to take off when the Americans arrived. They never got the chance.
The scene was everything a strafer pilot dreamed of.
60 Japanese bombers lined up on either side of the runway, engines warm, crews aboard, ready for takeoff.
The B-25 swept across the field at 200 miles per hour, 8 guns per aircraft pouring
fire into the parked bombers. Aircraft exploded, fuel tanks detonated, pilots died in their cockpits before they could even begin their takeoff rolls. Over 5 days, the 5th Air Force destroyed more than 170 Japanese aircraft.
The 4th Air Army was reduced to an operational strength of about 30 planes.
Japanese air power in New Guinea never recovered. Meanwhile, North American
aviation had finally acknowledged what Gunn had proven in combat. The strafer
configuration worked. The company began incorporating variations of Gunn's modifications into production aircraft.
The B-25G model added a 75mm M4 cannon in the nose alongside 2 machine guns. The B-25H carried 4 nose guns plus 4 in blister packages plus a lighter T-13E1 cannon that reduced the punishing recoil. 14 forward-firing weapons on a single aircraft. The 75mm cannon was a bold experiment. It was essentially an M4 tank gun adapted for aircraft use. The barrel extended 9.5 feet through the nose of the aircraft with the breech mechanism extending under the pilot's seat. The navigator sitting behind the pilot loaded the 15-pound shells by hand. The cannon could penetrate the armor of any ship afloat. A direct hit would open a hole in a destroyer's hull large enough to walk through. Against transport ships and barges, it was overkill. One round would often sink a small vessel outright, but the cannon had serious limitations. It could only fire about 4 rounds during a single attack pass. Loading was slow and difficult, especially in a pitching, rolling aircraft. The recoil was punishing. When the cannon fired, the
Entire aircraft shuddered as if it had hit a wall. Pilots reported that instruments shook loose from their mounts. The compass deviation could reach 15 degrees. Most significantly, the cannon required a steady approach to aim accurately.
The pilot had to fly straight and level toward the target,
giving anti-aircraft gunners a perfect opportunity to track and engage. Many crews found the cannon more trouble than
it was worth. They preferred the machine guns, which allowed them to maintain evasive maneuvering throughout the
attack. Despite these limitations, the cannon-armed B-25 saw extensive service.
They proved effective against hardened targets like bunkers and bridge abutments.
Against shipping, they could
disable an enemy vessel's fire control systems with a single well-placed round,
allowing follow-up aircraft to skip-bomb the defenseless hulk.
But the ultimate expression of gun's vision came with the
B-25J model, which entered production in late 1943.
The solid-nose version of the J carried 850 caliber machine guns in the nose, 4 in blister packages, 2 in the dorsal turret, 2
in the waist, and 2 in the tail.
18 machine guns total, 8 of them
pointed forward. It was the most heavily armed aircraft in the American infantry. A single 12-plane squadron of B-25J strafers carried more 50 caliber machine guns than 4 infantry regiments. Their
combined firepower could put over 100,000 rounds per minute into a target area.
Nothing that floated or flew or crawled could survive that concentration of destruction. The Japanese called them flying machine gun nests. American crews called them executioners. Both names were accurate. By 1944, strafer
operations had evolved into a precisely choreographed form of destruction.
The aircraft attacked in waves. The first wave suppressed anti-aircraft fire. The second wave dropped parachute fragmentation bombs on personnel and equipment.
The third wave skip-bombed
hardened targets. The fourth wave strafed survivors. Each wave prepared the target for the next. The parachute fragmentation bombs called parafrags were another innovation perfected by Gunn and Kenney. Standard bombs released at
low altitude would bounce back up and destroy the aircraft that dropped them.
The parachute slowed the bomb's descent,
just enough for the aircraft to clear the blast radius. When the bombs hit, they scattered fragments over a wide area, shredding personnel and soft targets.
Against airfields, the parafrags were devastating. A single
B-25 could carry over 100 of the small bombs.
A 12-plane formation could
blanket an entire airfield with thousands of fragments, killing maintenance crews, puncturing fuel drums, shredding canvas tents, and damaging parked aircraft beyond repair. The technique proved devastating against Japanese positions throughout the Pacific. Airfields, harbors, supply dumps, troop concentrations, coastal shipping, everything was exposed to the strafers.
The Japanese could not transport troops or supplies during daylight without risking annihilation.
They were compelled to move only at night, which slowed their operations drastically and made coordination nearly impossible. Japanese soldiers grew to fear the unmistakable sound of approaching B-25s, the roar of the right-hand Cyclone engines at full throttle, the whine of propellers cutting through dense tropical air, and the sudden burst of machine gun fire. Men dove into foxholes and ditches, praying the guns would not find them. Those who hesitated perished. At Hollandia in March 1944, strafers destroyed over 300 Japanese planes on the ground, wiping out most of them.
At Rabaul, they methodically dismantled what had been the most formidable Japanese stronghold in the South Pacific.
By the time American forces invaded the Philippines in October 1944, the strafers had achieved total air dominance over the entire theater. Paul Gunn piloted many of these missions himself. Despite his rank, despite his age, and despite orders to remain on the ground, he refused to stop flying combat sorties. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross twice, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, and 9 Purple Hearts, wounded 9 times back in the cockpit.
In late 1944, Gunn suffered severe injuries during a Japanese bombing raid on Leyte.
The wounds finally grounded him. He was evacuated to Australia to recover, but by then, the war had decisively turned against Japan, and the moment Gunn had been fighting for was at last approaching. On February 3, 1945, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division broke through Japanese lines and raced toward Manila. General MacArthur had personally instructed the flying column to liberate Santo Tomas internment camp as swiftly as possible.
The Liberation Force arrived that evening.
Colonel Dave Hutchinson, commander of the 308th Bombardment Wing, a specialized unit overseeing forward operations, accompanied the force specifically to locate the gun family. He had known Papi for years and understood what the family meant to him. Inside the camp, Polly and her 4 children had endured more than 3 years of captivity, surviving starvation, disease, abuse, and the constant threat of execution. Japanese guards had grown increasingly cruel as the war turned against them, and in the final weeks, they stopped distributing food entirely.
Prisoners were dying of malnutrition.
The children, Paul, Nathan, Connie, and Julie, had matured in captivity. Paul and Nathan had become adept at smuggling scraps from Japanese refuse to sustain their family. They had discovered a hidden radio in the camp attic and provided other prisoners with news of the war, risking execution each time they climbed the stairs. When American tanks broke through the gates, Polly was among the first to greet them. She had not seen her husband in over 3 years and did not know if he was alive or dead.
Liberation had finally arrived.
The ordeal was not yet over. In the days following liberation, Japanese artillery shelled Santo Tomas repeatedly.
Shells struck buildings housing former prisoners.
The gun family survived by mere inches, sheltering in makeshift barricades as explosions rocked the compound. 2 weeks later, MacArthur visited Santo Tomas and personally met the gun family, arranging their transport to Australia, where Papi was convalescing.
After 3 years, 4 months, and 14 days of separation, the Gunn family was finally reunited.
Paul Gunn retired from the Army in 1948 as a colonel due to the physical toll of his wounds. He returned to the Philippines and rebuilt Philippine Airlines, which remains one of Asia's oldest carriers. On October 11, 1957, while piloting a Beech 18 on a charter flight in central Philippines, Gunn encountered a sudden storm. The aircraft crashed, and there were no survivors. Paul Irving Gunn was 57, just 1 week shy of his 58th birthday. He had once told friends he would die before 60, boots on and throttles wide open.
That is exactly how he went.
General Kenny wrote the saga of Papi Gunn, describing him as the most audacious and reckless officer he had ever known, yet also the most effective.
Gunn had single-handedly revolutionized American air power in the Pacific through sheer ingenuity and determination.
Major Edward Lane, who led the first strafer attack at the Bismarck Sea, did not survive the war. On April 30, 1943, less than 2 months after his greatest victory, Lane was killed in a landing accident at Dobadura. Performing his trademark low approach, a steep dive followed by a sharp pull-up, with an overloaded B-25, the plane stalled, spun, and crashed.
8 men perished, including Lane, leaving behind a wife and 2 daughters.
Captain John Hennebrey assumed command of the 90th Bomb Squadron, leading the strafers through the remainder of the New Guinea campaign and into the Philippines.
After the war, he became a jet aviation pioneer and eventually a major general.
General George Kenny commanded all Allied air forces in the Pacific until the war's end. On September 2, 1945, he stood aboard the battleship Missouri as MacArthur accepted Japan's surrender. Kenny later became the first commander of Strategic Air Command and passed away in 1977 at age 88. The B-25 Mitchell remained in service well after the war, flying combat missions in Korea, serving as trainers, reconnaissance aircraft, and cargo haulers. Into the 1960s, some continued flying as air tankers and sprayers into the 1970s. Nearly 10,000 were built, more than any other American medium bomber, ranking 3rd overall behind the B-24 Liberator and B-17 Flying Fortress. The strafer variants hold a unique place in aviation history, representing an unprecedented concept, a bomber capable of fighting its way to the target rather than relying solely on escorts. This idea evolved into dedicated ground attack aircraft like the A-26 Invader and ultimately the A-10 Thunderbolt, armed with a 30mm Gatling gun firing nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. The philosophical lineage is clear: equip a ground attack aircraft with overwhelming forward firepower, suppress enemy defenses during the approach, and deliver precision weapons to the target. This doctrine, first developed by Papi Gunn in Brisbane in 1942, continues in modern gunships such as the AC-130, circling above battlefields with side-firing cannons, howitzers, and Gatling guns.
The method differs, but the underlying principle is identical. Combine concentrated firepower with precision to destroy targets conventional bombers cannot reach.
From Papi Gunn's workshop to today's close air support aircraft, his influence persists. Every time an American gunship strafes an enemy position, it follows the doctrine Gunn created in 1942 with salvaged guns and sheet metal. Innovation in wartime often emerges not through committees or bureaucracies, but through individuals like Papi Gunn who identify a problem, devise a solution, and act without waiting for permission. North American Aviation eventually integrated his modifications into production aircraft, though he received no public credit. Official histories attribute the Strafer concept to engineering analysis and operational feedback, mentioning gun only in footnotes and personal recollections. Recognition meant little to him. He modified the B-25 to kill Japanese forces and rescue his family.
Everything else was incidental.
Ultimately, 18 machine guns on a single aircraft changed the Pacific War. They enabled American pilots to sweep enemy ships from the sea and aircraft from the skies, proving bombers could accomplish more than dropping bombs from altitude.
They demonstrated that ingenuity and resolve could overcome any obstacle, and they reunited one family.
That is the story of the B-25 Strafer, born of a father's desperation and culminating in a transformation of American air power, marked by moments of brilliance, tragedy, and triumph that deserve remembrance. If you found this story compelling, please like this video to help share more forgotten World War II histories. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold stories. Each one matters and deserves to be remembered.
Leave a comment below sharing where you are watching from.
From veterans to history enthusiasts, our community spans the globe.
Thank you for watching and for keeping these stories alive.